Snow came down like whispered prayers, soft and endless, swallowing the sound of everything that once lived on the mountain. The valley below had already gone still for the season, roofs buried, fences vanished under white. But up here, where the road ended in a scatter of pine and stone, one small cabin still breathed. A curl of smoke rose from its crooked chimney, thin, uncertain, like an old soul exhaling against time itself. Inside, Elias Wren sat beside the hearth, his hands hovering above the fire. The flames painted his face in amber and shadow, tracing the lines carved by years of work and quiet heartbreak. His wife Maeve moved slowly around the room, tucking wool into the cracks of the window frame to keep the draft at bay. Their dog Ash lay curled near the door, half asleep, his fur the same gray as the ashes in the stove. Neither of them spoke of the truck that had driven away that morning, its tires crunching down the frozen path. They had watched it from the porch, their children inside, eyes forward, the windows fogged. Not a wave, not a glance back, just the engine fading into the valley and then silence. Maeve had kept her hand lifted until the sound was gone, her fingers trembling in the cold. That silence still filled the house, heavier than the snow pressing on the roof. Elias chopped wood behind the cabin until his shoulders burned, though they needed no more. Maeve folded and refolded the same blanket, as if neat corners could hold something together that was already unraveling. When dusk came, she lit the old lantern and set it by the window. Her reflection wavered in the glass, a ghost of herself, waiting for light to return from somewhere beyond the trees. They had built this cabin 40 years ago, when love was loud and laughter came easy. Every beam had been raised by hand, every board nailed down between shared breaths and dreams of children running through the snow. Now the walls carried those echoes like the inside of a seashell, faint, unreachable. Maeve sat down beside the fire and spoke at last, her voice barely more than the crackle of pine sap. "They didn't even take the quilt I made." Elias stared into the flames. "They got no need for quilts in the city." Her lips pressed together. "I thought warmth was something you always needed." He wanted to answer, but words felt too blunt against the ache in her voice. Instead, he reached for another log and placed it carefully on the fire, the small gesture saying what he could not. That warmth still mattered here, even if it came only from their own hands. Days passed in a kind of suspended quiet. Snow covered the garden Maeve used to tend, burying the last dry stalks of rosemary. The chicken coop stood empty, its door unhinged, wind whistling through it like a forgotten tune. Elias's boots left deep tracks between the shed and the porch, filling overnight as though the mountain wished to erase their persistence. Sometimes faint voices drifted up the valley, echoes from the town. Maeve would stop her knitting and listen. They never reached her clearly enough to make out words, but she could imagine them: gossip, pity, judgment. Poor Wrens left all alone up there. The sound would fade, and she would turn back to her work, her eyes distant and wet with the reflection of the fire. Elias carried his solitude like an old coat, worn thin but familiar. He rose early, split logs, fixed the leaking gutter, and mended a fence no one would see. He didn't tell Maeve that he still checked the mailbox at the foot of the trail every few days, brushing away snow to find nothing but cold air. Once he found a scrap of newspaper stuck to the box, a story about city lights and winter markets. He folded it and brought it home anyway, leaving it on the table where she might think it was something. At night, Maeve boiled tea leaves until the scent filled the cabin, sharp and bitter. She spoke to Ash as if he were human, and sometimes Elias listened from the doorway, feeling both comforted and unbearably sad. "You remember when the boys used to hide under the table?" she'd whisper. Ash would lift his head, tail tapping faintly against the floorboards. "They'd wait till I turned my back and steal biscuits." Elias would laugh, say, "Let them have joy while it's sweet." He doesn't laugh much anymore. The dog sighed and rested his head again. Maeve brushed her hand over his fur and closed her eyes. The storm that arrived that week seemed determined to finish what loneliness had started. The wind screamed across the ridge, shaking shutters loose, flinging needles from the pines like arrows. The roof groaned. Elias stayed up all night reinforcing beams, nailing planks against the wind's fury. Maeve sat near the fire, her face pale in the flicker. Ash whimpered at her feet. When morning came, the world outside was gone. Nothing but white and more white. The path erased. They were sealed in. 2 aging hearts in a box of snow. Elias tried to keep busy, but his hands bled from the cold. Maeve wrapped them in cloth and whispered prayers over the bruises. Her touch lingered longer than necessary, trembling. "You should rest," she said. He shook his head. "Rest is for the ones who've given up." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw how tired he was, how much his pride cost him. That night she dreamed of warmth, children laughing, sunlight through open windows, the smell of bread. But when she woke, the cabin was dark except for the faint glow of embers. The next evening, while the storm still rattled the world, Ash lifted his head suddenly and growled. Elias rose, wary. He opened the door against the wind, and there, half buried in snow, was a small movement, faint and trembling. A pup, white as frost, ribs sharp against its skin, eyes cloudy with fear. Elias scooped it up without a word. Maeve gasped when he brought it close to the fire. The tiny creature shivered violently, its breath shallow. She wrapped it in her shawl and pressed it to her chest. "Poor thing," she whispered. "You came from nowhere." Elias stared down at the fragile life between them. The pup blinked weakly, a soft whimper escaping its throat. "Looks half dead," he murmured. Maeve smiled faintly. "So did we once." They fed it warm milk from a spoon, took turns through the night keeping it close to the fire. By dawn, the shivering stopped. The pup's small paw twitched against Maeve's palm. She brushed a tear from her cheek and whispered, "You'll live." "You must." Elias built a small wooden box beside the hearth, lining it with an old coat. The pup curled into it, sighing in its sleep. Ash lay beside the box, protective but calm, as if he knew something had shifted. They named the little one Whisper. Maeve said it suited him. He had arrived like one, soft and unexpected, carrying the weight of everything unsaid. Whisper grew stronger each day, and with him, the cabin seemed to breathe again. Maeve laughed softly when he stumbled across the floor, chasing his own tail. Elias found himself speaking more, short sentences, small observations about the firewood or the shape of the moon, but still, it was speech. The silence loosened its grip. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside there was movement again, the kind that meant life. Maeve began humming while she worked, old lullabies that once belonged to the children. Elias repaired the old rocking chair and placed it near the fire, where she could sit and sew. Ash would rest nearby, his eyes on Whisper, who nipped playfully at his ears. Some nights, when the wind pressed hard against the windows, Maeve would whisper, "Do you think they'll ever come back?" Elias didn't answer. He'd just place another log on the fire, his face turned away so she couldn't see the truth there. The fire crackled. Shadows danced, and the mountain watched in silence. One morning, as dawn spilled blue light through the window, Elias stepped outside. The storm had passed. Snow glittered like crushed glass across the valley. He stood there for a long while, breathing in the cold, feeling something shift quietly inside him. Not forgiveness yet, but the beginning of it. When he came back in, Maeve was feeding Whisper bits of bread soaked in milk. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright in the way he hadn't seen in months. The pup wagged his tiny tail, and for a heartbeat, Elias saw something almost like joy. He knelt beside them, the boards creaking beneath his knees, and ran his rough hand over the pup's fur. Warmth spread through his fingers, simple, fragile, and real. Maeve met his gaze, and for the first time since their children left, she smiled without effort. "He's hope, Eli," she said softly. "Small but alive." He nodded, unable to speak. The cabin seemed to listen, the fire humming gently, the air lighter somehow. Outside, the snow began to fall again, but this time it felt different, softer, almost kind. Elias looked through the window at the white hills stretching endlessly beyond, and he thought, perhaps the mountain hadn't forgotten them after all. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for them to remember how to live. The day ended quietly. The dog slept near the fire, Maeve's hand resting on Elias's arm. The flames flickered low, warm against the wooden walls that once knew only silence, and as night came down again, Elias whispered into the stillness, "We'll make it through this one." Maeve's voice answered from the half-dark, tender and certain, "We always do." The fire crackled, the mountain breathed, and the little cabin held its fragile heartbeat steady against the cold. The thaw came slowly, like forgiveness learning how to speak. Each morning, the snow retreated a little farther down the mountain, revealing patches of brown earth, bent grass, and the first shy shoots of green. The air carried a damp sweetness now, the scent of pine sap waking from sleep. Inside the cabin, the fire burned lower, but the light that filled the rooms came from something other than flame. Whisper had grown, his once frail body now strong, his coat thick and bright against the wooden floors. Maeve moved more lightly than she had in months. There was a steadiness in her hands again when she worked, a hum beneath her breath that carried warmth. She had begun saving the crumbs from their meals in a small tin, scattering them on the porch each morning for the birds. At first, none came, but on the third day, a sparrow appeared, one speck of movement against the stillness. Maeve watched it from the window with tears in her eyes. "The world remembers us, Eli," she said quietly. Elias only smiled and went on repairing the fence that winter had battered down. His hands, still scarred from cold, moved with a calm determination. Each nail he drove into the wood seemed to echo his own resolve, to rebuild what had been broken, to believe in something again, even if no one was watching. Whisper followed him everywhere, bounding through the slush, his paws leaving tiny trails that looked almost like writing in the melting snow. Elias began to talk to him as he worked. Not full sentences, just fragments. "That beam'll hold now," or "See that ridge, boy? That's where the sun hits first come summer." It wasn't conversation, but it was enough to fill the silence that had once pressed so heavy on his chest. Maeve spent her afternoons near the window, mending clothes, her hair catching the light like threads of silver spun fine. Sometimes she'd pause to watch Elias through the glass, how he straightened, stretched his back, then bent again to his task. There was love in her gaze, quiet and steady, the kind that doesn't demand to be seen. Ash's grave lay beneath the old pine behind the cabin. When the snow melted fully, Maeve planted wildflowers there, the kind that could survive thin soil and cold wind. Whisper would sit beside her as she worked, his nose pressed to the ground, his eyes alert and soft. Elias stood at a distance, hat in hand, as if the simple act of planting something living was its own prayer. One morning, the distant sound of hooves and wheels climbed up the trail, unfamiliar after so long. Maeve lifted her head from the stove, her heart stuttering. A wagon appeared between the trees, carrying two townsfolk, Mr. Hobbs, the storekeeper, and his wife. They had come to check on the wrens, bringing flour, candles, and gossip. When they reached the cabin, their eyes widened. The place was almost unrecognizable. The roof was mended, the windows framed in new pine, and beneath the eaves hung bundles of drying herbs. Smoke drifted from the chimney, not desperate now, but steady and sweet. "Well, I'll be," Mr. Hobbs said, stepping down. "You folks turned this place into a little Eden." Maeve smiled politely. "It just needed care, that's all." Mrs. Hobbs handed her the flower, glancing around with cautious admiration. "Everyone in town figured you'd gone under by now. But look at this. Mercy. It's beautiful." Elias came from behind the house, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyes met theirs, calm but unreadable. "We had help," he said, glancing toward Whisper, who wagged his tail at their feet. The couple stayed only a short while, uneasy in the stillness that lingered around the place. When they left, Maeve watched them disappear down the trail, feeling something strange, not pride, not sorrow, but peace. Their gossip would carry down to town like all gossip does, but this time it would bring wonder, not pity. In the days that followed, spring settled in fully. Streams began to hum again, threading silver between rocks. Birds nested in the eaves. The world outside their door had softened. But even peace, Elias knew, asks for proof. The proof came one afternoon when the sky darkened without warning. Clouds rolled down the mountain, heavy and cold. The air sharpened. Whisper barked once, ears pricked, and then the first flakes began to fall. Thick, fast, relentless. It was not the gentle snow of December, but the violent return of winter, sudden and merciless. By nightfall, the storm howled. The cabin shuddered under its weight. Maeve stood by the fire, arms wrapped around herself. It's too soon, she whispered. The earth isn't ready. Elias was already at the door, pulling on his coat. The animals will be frightened. I'll check the shed. Whisper barked again, restless. Then, a sound, distant but sharp. The cry of something small and wounded. Elias froze. He's out there. Maeve's hand caught his arm. Eli. No! You can't! But he was already stepping into the storm, the wind tearing the door from his grasp. Snow struck his face like shards of glass. He called out, but the wind devoured his voice. All he could see were flickers of movement, shadows, trees bending, the faint shape of his dog darting between drifts. Whisper. His voice cracked, swallowed by the cold. He followed the sound, slipping, sliding, his boots sinking deep. Then he saw it, a narrow ravine, half covered by ice, and below, a trembling shape trying to climb out. Whisper. His small body scrabbled against the slope, falling back each time. Elias tied the rope he carried around his waist, anchored it to a tree, and lowered himself down. His fingers burned. The rope bit into his palms. Easy now, he murmured through his teeth. Whisper whimpered, pawing at his arm. Elias grabbed him, pulling him tight to his chest, then began the climb back up. The ice broke beneath his boots once, twice, but he held on, dragging himself and the dog back to the surface. By the time he reached the cabin, his breath came ragged, his coat soaked through. Maeve flung the door open, her eyes wide with terror and relief. Oh, Eli! She took Whisper from his arms, pressing the dog to her heart. Elias sank to his knees by the fire, trembling, his hands blue at the knuckles. She knelt beside him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders, her own tears falling freely. You could have died, she whispered. He looked at her, exhausted, his voice hoarse. Would have been worth it. The fire crackled. Whisper stirred, safe now, his eyes reflecting the glow. Maeve rested her forehead against Elias's and closed her eyes. For a long time neither spoke. The storm raged outside, but inside, something stronger had taken hold. A quiet vow that nothing would be taken from them again without a fight. By morning the world was white once more, but this time the snow glistened with light. The air was sharp and clean, filled with the dripping of thaw. Elias stepped outside, his arm around Maeve's waist, Whisper padding beside them. The sun broke through in sudden glory, washing the valley in gold. From where they stood, the cabin looked like part of the mountain itself, not a relic of hardship, but a home reborn. The pine above Ash's grave shimmered with frost, and beneath it, the first flowers had bloomed, small, defiant, reaching toward the weak light. Maeve leaned her head against Elias's shoulder. "It's strange," she said softly. "All that we lost, and yet, somehow, we have more than before." He nodded, his breath curling white in the cold. Maybe that's what living is. Losing just enough to make room for grace. Whisper barked once, chasing a bird that took flight toward the trees. The sound echoed through the valley, bright and alive. Elias laughed, a low, rough laugh that felt like it had been waiting years to return. Maeve joined him, her voice lifting into the clear air until it felt as though even the mountain was listening. Time passed gently after that. Visitors came. Sometimes, travelers, wanderers, the curious, drawn by the story of the cabin that had turned from ruin to refuge. Some brought food, others just questions, and all left changed in ways they couldn't name. Elias and Maeve welcomed them with tea, stories, and silence when words were too small. Whisper always lay by the door, watchful, his tail thumping softly when anyone approached. Years later, when the mountain would tell its tales through the tongues of strangers, theirs would be whispered most often. The wrens who had been left behind, yet built something beautiful from what remained. One evening, long after the thaw had become spring again, Maeve sat on the porch, the sky burning pink over the ridge. Whisper rested his head on her lap. Elias stood beside her, his arm draped lightly across her shoulders. They watched the valley glow. No words were needed. Somewhere below, the faint hum of the town carried upward. laughter, the clink of glasses, the sound of life moving on. It no longer hurt to hear it. Maeve turned to Elias, her voice tender, worn smooth by time. "Do you think they know we're happy?" He smiled, eyes still on the horizon. "Doesn't matter, Maeve. The mountain knows. That's enough." The wind picked up gently, lifting the scent of pine and smoke. Whisper barked once into the distance, a sound half play, half song. And if you listen closely, the old soul might say, you can still hear them. Two hearts, one fire, and a dog's quiet joy, keeping the mountain warm through every winter since. Because some homes aren't built from wood or stone, but from what refuses to die. And if this story found its way to you, perhaps it's because you too have something left to rebuild. So linger here a moment. Let the silence speak. And if their whisper touched your heart, follow it. Let it live on, one story to the next, carried softly through the snow.